Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're here, you're looking for a shortcut to deep, actionable knowledge, the kind of information that, actually helps you organize the chaos of life. Today, we are taking that concept pretty literally because we are diving deep into internal cartography.
We are indeed. We're moving past the abstract and getting into, you could say, the physical geography of your inner landscape. This deep dive focuses on Lesson 3 of the Internal Family Systems Framework, or IFS. For anyone who's been curious about self-discovery or has ever felt, overwhelmed by their own reactions, this is the map you need.
That's right. Our specific mission today, and we've pulled this straight from the sources you shared, is focused on identifying your inner parts. We've talked about the idea of an internal family before, but now we are doing the hard, crucial work of recognition.
Putting names to faces, so to speak.
Exactly. The goal is to provide you, the learner, with a concrete, accessible pathway to understanding how your own psyche is truly structured. We want to identify the various internal parts that are constantly influencing your thoughts, your feelings, and, of course, your resulting behaviors.
I like to think of it this way. Your mind is this complex organization,
Yeah.
right? But if you don't know who the employees are or their roles or what they're trying to do, the company just runs chaotically.
Total chaos.
Identifying the parts is about assigning names and job descriptions to those internal voices. And this is a vital, truly transformative step in any healing journey.
And we know this framework is particularly critical for those navigating the pervasive challenges that come with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. And the reason why is, well, identifying these parts allows you to shift from feeling hopelessly overwhelmed by your internal life, like you're just caught in the storm, to cultivating a clear, intentional self-awareness where you could actually start to pilot the ship.
It's the difference between hearing a chaotic internal roar and actually listening respectfully to individual voices, each with its own history and its own needs.
So as we dive into these sources today, what can the listener, our learner, really expect to walk away knowing? What's the core toolkit we are handing them?
We're aiming for true operational knowledge here. By the end of this deep dive, you won't just be able to, define the parts. You'll be able to recognize and name the distinct parts that exist within you.
Okay.
You'll understand their roles and functions, and this is the key, recognize that even the behaviors that seem really destructive usually stem from a protective, survival-based intent.
That's such a huge shift in perspective.
It is, and crucially, you'll be able to explain exactly how the interplay between these parts affects your immediate responses to stress and trauma.
And we will anchor all of this, and this is non-negotiable in IFS, in the requirement of recognizing and practicing self-compassion throughout the entire process. Because if you approach your inner world with a critical hammer, those vulnerable parts are they're never going to come out of hiding. This journey is one of radical acceptance, not judgment.
Well said.
So where do we begin?
Let's start with IFS as a comprehensive framework, the foundational map, if you will. The core principle that IFS posits is it's a radical one for traditional psychology. The idea is that the psyche is not a single unified entity that needs to be fixed or managed as a whole.
Which is such a relief to hear, honestly.
Isn't it? Instead, it's inherently pluralistic. It's comprised of these distinct parts, and each one possesses its own beliefs, its own roles, functions, feelings, and often their own memories.
That concept alone, the plurality of the mind, is so powerful for so many people. It instantly shifts the narrative, like you said, from I am fundamentally broken or I am flawed to something more like I have a complex internal system that is currently disorganized or maybe running on outdated software.
Exactly. It's so much less about pathology and more about, say, internal political management.
I like that.
And the ultimate goal is not to eradicate the parts you dislike. You can't fire them. The goal is to achieve internal harmony, to foster a compassionate, democratic dialogue among all these inner voices.
And you start from the position that every single part, no exceptions, is fundamentally trying to help you survive.
That's the bedrock. Every part serves a protective purpose, even if the method it's using today is causing you harm.
And this framework, as our sources really emphasize, seems uniquely suited for healing those vulnerable aspects of the self and for managing the lingering complexity of CPTSD. So why are IFS and CPTSD so intrinsically linked? Let's really unpack that mechanism.
Okay, so to get this, we have to understand that CPTSD emerges from prolonged or repeated exposure to trauma. It's often interpersonal, and it often happens during our formative years. So we're not talking about a single event, like a car crash.
Right. It's a sustained environment of threat.
Exactly. And when that trauma is sustained over time, the vulnerable, spontaneous, curious aspects of the self, what a lot of people call the inner child, they get overwhelmed, they get injured, and eventually they get stifled.
The system just can't afford that kind of vulnerability anymore.
It can't. It's too dangerous. So the system, in a brilliant act of survival, it fragments.
It fragments.
The core wounds, feelings like profound worthlessness, toxic shame, the terror of abandonment, they become too overwhelming to function with on a daily basis. So the rest of the internal system steps up and it steps in to push those painful parts out of your awareness.
And that leads directly to the core challenges we see with CPTSD.
It does. Things like extreme emotional dysregulation, an unshakable negative self-perception, chronic difficulty in maintaining trusting relationships. The inner family is now structured entirely around defense, not spontaneity and connection.
Which is why just trying to manage the symptoms often fails if you're only targeting the behavior. You might tell yourself, just stop having emotional outbursts. But if you don't know which internal part is triggering the outburst,
the effort is futile. It's like a battle against shadows. IFS provides the map for that fractured system. Without it, those pervasive symptoms, the chronic self-criticism, the sudden anxiety, the need for control, they just feel like personal failings.
right, it's your fault.
Right. But with IFS, you can identify the patterns and you realize, that critical self-talk isn't my fault. That's a manager part. And that manager believes that if I criticize myself first and work perfectly, I will be safe from external threat.
And then you can identify the part holding the pain, the exile, and work toward healing those vulnerable aspects that have been stifled for so long.
So understanding IFS is really the crucial first step towards self-leadership. It teaches you to identify the source and the protective intent of the trauma response rather than just judging the behavior that results from it.
That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so let's unpack the system structure then, because the sources are really helpful in classifying this, this huge crowd of internal voices into clear categories. And the beauty of the model lies in its simplicity. It gives us an immediate way to organize what feels like total chaos.
So we categorize the myriad inner parts into 3 primary types, and it's based on their function and their timing. We have the exiles, the managers, and the firefighters.
Right.
And these roles are so significant because understanding them is the foundational vocabulary for applying any IFS principle.
Yeah.
It's the language we need to begin that internal dialogue.
And we have to emphasize this again. Their job description was written entirely in response to difficult, often traumatic, life events.
They're reactive.
Every single part is fundamentally reactive to the past, and it's just aiming for stability in the present. If we can recognize the historical context of their roles, we can approach them with the compassion they need.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds. Let's start with the parts themselves.
Let's delve into the most sensitive members of the internal family first, the exiles.
I often think of exiles as like the wounded protagonists of our internal drama. Who exactly are they in an operational sense?
They are, quite simply, the vulnerable core. Exiles are the parts that hold these deep reservoirs of pain, of overwhelming fear, toxic shame, and the raw trauma that results from past events.
The really heavy stuff.
The heaviest. And their function, their manifestation, it all stems from the fact that these emotions were just too much for the young system to handle. Therefore, they are isolated and deliberately hidden away, they're exiled, to protect the overall system, the self, from being constantly overwhelmed.
So it's the system basically saying, we cannot possibly function if this much agony is present, so we're going to lock it in the basement.
Exactly. That's a perfect metaphor. And that locking away process, it often happens very, very early in life. The trauma might be decades old, but the exile part remains frozen in time, still holding the full intensity of that initial pain.
Wow.
The source material highlights this with a really concrete example. A person might have an exile that represents a child's specific deep wound of abandonment that they experienced at, say, age 7.
So that vulnerability, that deep wound, it's not processed or healed, it's just sequestered, it's put away. And that exile, even today, is experiencing the world through the lens of that 7-year-old's terror of being alone.
That's the key insight. When that exile is activated, and it could be by a minor adult trigger, like a text message that goes unanswered for too long, The resulting emotional reaction isn't an adult one. It's the full-force, childlike emotional storm of that 7-year-old's abandonment terror.
Because the pain is locked away, it's undigested, it's still raw.
It's completely raw. So the goal for us, for you listening, is not to medicate or banish this pain further. The goal is just recognizing the exile.
Just to see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Recognizing them is the first crucial step toward a practice we call unblending, which is separating yourself from the part. It allows us to approach that vulnerable part with curiosity, like you would approach a frightened child. We need to explore their feelings and their needs because they hold the core wounds that need the light of the self for healing.
And if we ignore the exile,
If we ignore the exile, the system becomes incredibly rigid. It forces the other two types of parts, the managers and the firefighters, to work overtime, often desperately.
which brings us perfectly to the proactive protection team. The parts doing all the heavy lifting to keep that exile locked down? The managers.
Yes. The quintessential overachievers, the planners, the worrywarts, the internal taskmasters.
I think we all have a very active manager part. So how are they defined within this framework?
Managers are defined as the proactive parts, whose entire mission is to maintain absolute control over the self and the environment. And they do this to actively avoid triggering those vulnerable exiles.
So they're always looking ahead.
They're constantly looking forward, anticipating threats, managing risk, and preemptively ensuring that everything is safe and correct. They're the system's proactive protectors.
They are the gatekeepers of the pain. And they're operating under the assumption that if they can just arrange life perfectly,
The exile's pain will never surface.
Ex-
Their internal logic is often something like, if we act perfectly, if we never show weakness, if we are always productive and pleasing, then the fear of worthlessness or rejection held by the exile will never get a chance to resurface.
they sacrifice ease for what they perceive as safety.
Guaranteed safety. But it's a false promise, of course.
And their function and manifestation are so visible in our daily lives, and they're often disguised as virtues. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Managers manifest as these intense behaviors like perfectionism or chronic caretaking of others, compulsive planning,
Or that critical self-talk.
or critical self-talk. That's a huge one. That voice, which feels so damaging, is actually the manager trying to police your internal thoughts and behaviors to ensure no dangerous vulnerabilities slip out.
So this is where we need to apply that lens of compassion and inquiry you mentioned. If the manager's intent is protection, why does that critical self-talk feel so profoundly damaging?
Because it's operating with an outdated survival mandate. That's the key. It believes that criticizing you first is the best way to motivate you to avoid failure. Or that, preemptive self-flagellation might lessen the pain of an external failure.
I'll beat them to the punch.
Precisely. Its intent is preservation, but its effect is self-loathing and a really rigid way of living.
Let's use the example from the source material. It says, when faced with a challenging task, a manager part might push an individual to work excessively hard at the point of burnout. What's the true cost and the underlying mechanism of that exhaustive effort?
Well, the cost is enormous. It's loss of connection, loss of rest, of joy. The underlying mechanism is pure desperate fear. The manager is terrified that any failure, any lack of perfect effort would expose the exile's core wound, that feeling of being worthless or not enough.
So it's all about avoiding that feeling.
All about it. The manager forces exhaustive effort and perfectionism, creating this prison of productivity, all in the name of containing that deep-seated pain. They try to control the entire internal and external environment.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. Living under the tyrannical control of an active manager part. It keeps us safe from the past, but it costs us the ability to live easily and spontaneously in the present.
They absolutely do. And what happens when the manager's intricate control system fails? Because life is inherently unpredictable. External triggers inevitably slip past the defenses.
This system breaks down.
That control system shatters, and the exile breaks through. And that's when the third category, the emergency services, they step in.
The desperate escape artists.
Yeah.
The firefighters.
Yes, the firefighters. They are defined as the parts that act reactively and impulsively when the exiles are triggered, despite the manager's often exhausting efforts to prevent it.
So the manager is the early, proactive warning system and the boundary enforcer.
And the firefighter is the immediate, desperate emergency shutdown protocol.
Got it.
Their function and manifestation involve engaging in impulsive, often extreme behaviors that are designed to quickly distract, soothe, or numb the overwhelming pain that is rushing up from the exile.
They don't plan.
They don't plan. They simply react to the emotional emergency. They are designed to extinguish the emotional fire started by a triggered exile, at all costs.
And the source material gives some very clear, specific examples of these firefighter behaviors, which I think we all recognize as maladaptive coping mechanisms.
We do. We see substance use, anything from alcohol to opioids. We see binge eating, excessive spending or gambling, self-harm, or even rapid, intense relationship cycling.
So these behaviors are powerful, immediate forms of distraction.
Yes, they temporarily block the pain the exile is emitting. When that pain becomes too hot to bear, the firefighter grabs the nearest tool, often a harmful one, and just throws it onto the flame to create immediate numbness or distraction.
Let's trace that common dynamic you mentioned. A manager tries to arrange a perfect week. Then, an unexpected, maybe even minor rejection happens. A friend cancels dinner, or a critical email arrives. The manager fails. The exile of worthlessness rushes forward, and before the self can intervene, a firefighter might take control.
And that leads the individual straight to a destructive behavior, maybe hours of dissociative scrolling on their phone or an intense rage directed at a loved one.
That pattern is the internal civil war in action.
It is. And understanding this role is absolutely crucial for healing. Because when we engage in these behaviors, our first reaction is often to judge ourselves fiercely.
I shouldn't have eaten that. I lack discipline. I am weak.
All of that. But IFS teaches us to look deeper, past the behavior, to the desperate intent. The firefighter's intent is survival and immediate radical relief from unbearable pain.
So when a firefighter takes over, the question we need to ask is not, why did I do that?
But what are you trying to protect me from? What is the feeling you are desperate to avoid or distract me from right now? That shift in inquiry is the first step toward healthier responses.
It moves us from self-judgment to self-understanding.
And we recognize that the manager and the firefighter are not our enemies. They're both deeply committed protective forces whose methods simply need updating because the war they were designed to fight, the childhood trauma, is over.
So we've identified the internal staff, the wounded exiles, the rigid managers, and the desperate firefighters. But who is the compassionate CEO capable of unifying this organization? That brings us to the core of guidance in IFS, the self.
This is, for me, perhaps the most liberating concept in all of IFS. The self is not another part. It is the uninjured core essence of who you are. It is inherently wise, whole, and it's always present no matter how chaotic or traumatized the system might be.
It can't be damaged.
It cannot be damaged. The goal of IFS is simply to access it or to unblend from our parts so that the self can lead.
And the self embodies these distinct, accessible qualities. The broader IFS literature talks about the 8 C's or P's, but our sources focus on 4 essential, immediately applicable attributes.
Exactly. The self embodies calmness, curiosity, compassion, and courage. These 4 qualities are always available to you, and they serve as the compass when you begin the work of identifying and engaging your parts. They are the tools of leadership.
Let's just operationalize those C's for a moment. Calmness allows us to sit with the extreme discomfort of a triggered exile without panicking or letting a firefighter take over.
Yes. Calmness provides the necessary space. Then, curiosity enables us to approach the part, say, the critical manager, and ask why it is acting the way it is instead of immediately judging it or trying to silence it.
Curiosity opens the door to dialogue.
It does, and compassion is what's required to accept the pain and acknowledge the desperate efforts of the protective parts. You cannot negotiate with a part you hate.
That's a powerful statement.
And finally, courage is required to actually approach the vulnerable exiles in the basement. It takes courage to look directly at shame or fear or the terror of abandonment and say, I see you, I am here now, you are safe. These are the resources we need to stabilize the entire system.
So the immediate action here is engaging with the self. That is the only mechanism that can foster a truly nurturing relationship with those vulnerable exiles and help mitigate the extreme controlling behaviors of the managers and the desperate reactions of the firefighters.
You're right. You can't successfully lead the internal family if you are not operating from your calm, curious, compassionate center.
This leads us directly to the concept that isn't just a therapeutic recommendation, but an absolute prerequisite for IFS to work.
Yes, the imperative of self-compassion.
This isn't just about being nice to yourself, is it? It's the core operational principle that allows parts to change their roles.
It is the hinge upon which the entire healing journey turns. Fostering self-compassion requires approaching oneself and every single internal voice with radical kindness and unconditional understanding. It means you drop the internal hammer of judgment forever. You have to recognize that judgment is itself the voice of a rigid manager part.
And this application of compassion is, I imagine, toughest, but also most necessary when you're confronting the painful or challenging parts. It's incredibly difficult to feel compassionate toward the firefighter part that just led you into debt or ruined a relationship.
It is one of the hardest shifts in perspective to make. But we have to consciously and repeatedly acknowledge that every part, regardless of how destructive its current behavior is, plays a critical historical role in your survival and coping.
So that manager's rigidity, that might have been what allowed you to complete college despite chaos at home.
Absolutely. Or the firefighter's numb distraction. That might have kept you from ending things when the pain was simply unbearable.
So if the manager's rigidity is a wall of defense and the firefighter's action is a desperate distraction,
Then self-compassion is the key. It's what unlocks the door to the exile, and it offers that vulnerable part a safe, warm place to finally come out of hiding and receive actual care from the self.
it changes everything.
It absolutely does. Developing the sustained, non-judgmental self-compassion enhances your ability to interact with your entire inner system in a positive, unifying way. And that is what leads to profound healing and integration. When you approach a part with gratitude for its service, even if that service is outdated, it becomes much more willing to negotiate a new role in the system.
Okay, we've established the theoretical map. Now we need to put boots on the ground. We need to move from the foundational theory of IFS to the highly practical, actionable steps for identification and engagement.
This is the moment of truth.
Right.
If you want self-leadership, you must first know who is speaking at any given moment. This is all about unblending, creating space between the self and the part.
And the foundational step, as laid out in the sources, is identifying these parts through structured self-reflection and mindfulness. So the first step is a structured mindfulness practice. The instruction is pretty simple. Sit quietly for, say, 5 to 10 minutes and focus entirely on your breath or some neutral sensory input. But here's the critical action. You have to observe any thoughts, feelings, or sensations that arise without engaging or judging them.
That lack of judgment is what allows the self to emerge. If you immediately think, oh, I shouldn't be thinking about that embarrassing event, that judgmental voice is a manager. You simply note, a critical manager is present, and you return to observing. We're just looking for the internal traffic flow. What are the persistent recurring thoughts? Where do I feel tension in my body?
And this moves seamlessly into the second technique, which is journaling. Immediately after your mindfulness practice, you write down the thoughts, the distinct feelings, the physical sensations you noticed.
And pay close attention to the tone and the perspective of the distinct voices.
This is where you start to categorize them.
Exactly. You might notice one voice consistently uses aggressive, absolute language like, you always ruin things. You write that down and give it a temporary name, the crusher. You might notice another voice that feels deeply sad and small, and it's usually accompanied by a tension in your chest. That could be the sad one. This documentation, it allows you to see the patterns that define the parts.
As this reflection continues, you must actively look to identify roles. Look for the recurring themes. Is this a voice that plans, criticizes, or worries excessively? That's probably a manager. Is this a voice that feels overwhelming pain or shame? That's an exile.
Right. Or is this a voice that screams, I need a drink now? That's a firefighter.
It becomes clearer over time.
And remember, the spectrum of emotion, the sources remind us, is embodied in these parts. Fear, anger, sadness, even joy can be parts. The process of naming them, giving them a descriptive title like the perfectionist planner manager or the shame-holding exile, is profoundly empowering.
Why is that?
Because it externalizes the feeling just enough so you can relate to it rather than feeling completely fused with it. You are observing the driver, not being the car.
That's a great distinction. Okay, so we've identified them. But just recognizing them isn't enough to foster healing. The crucial next step is intentional engagement to cultivate a relationship built on compassionate respect. This moves us from observation to genuine internal interaction.
This is the therapeutic heart of the model. The first core technique here is dialogue with your parts. This involves imagining a conversation with each part, but critically, having that dialogue originate from the self, from a place of curiosity and calmness. You approach the part and ask them direct questions about their function.
So instead of being angry at the firefighter for making you overspend, you imagine sitting down with that part and asking, hello, firefighter, from a place of pure curiosity. What are you trying to protect me from right now? What is the feeling, the panic, the emptiness you are so desperate to distract me from? And how old do you feel right now?
Those are perfect questions. That dialogue provides tremendous insight into the motivation and the history of the part. If the firefighter says, "I distract you so the pain doesn't swallow us," you learn that the core issue is the depth of the pain, not the distraction itself. You are showing respect for their effort.
And another incredibly powerful practical technique is visualization. Visualize these inner parts as distinct characters, figures, or even forces of nature. Our imagination is a profound asset here.
It really is.
Yeah.
You might visualize your manager as a severely dressed executive sitting at a spotless desk juggling 7 phones, and you can ask that executive, "Why are you working so hard? What are you afraid will happen if you stop?"
Or your exile.
You might visualize your exile as a small, silent child hiding under a tattered blanket in a dark corner. You approach that child not as an adult, but as the self, with calmness and compassion. And you simply offer them warmth or a safe word. This visualization helps you connect more deeply and understand their unique, often desperate perspectives because it makes them tangible.
And leading all of this is the principle of compassionate inquiry. You have to approach each identified part with curiosity, kindness, and deep respect.
And you have to acknowledge their historical contributions to your survival and express gratitude for their roles, even the challenging ones.
Gratitude is essential.
It is, because every part is working tirelessly on your behalf, even if their methods are causing present-day difficulties. The firefighter that led to years of emotional dysregulation kept you alive when the pain was simply too much to bear. So you thank it for its service, and then from the self you ask, "I know you were trying to help, but your methods are hurting the system. Would you be willing to step back slightly so that I, the self, can try a new, healthier approach to caring for the exile?"
That's how you negotiate change. It's not a hostile takeover.
It's a compassionate reorganization.
So by practicing these techniques, mindfulness, journaling, dialogue, and visualization, you systematically cultivate a more compassionate, understanding relationship with your inner parts. And that allows for healing and integration over time.
And this isn't just theory. Engaging in these practices deepens your understanding of the immediate dynamics of your inner system, moving you toward real integration.
So let's give our learner, the listener, 3 focused self-assessment questions, some reflection prompts, to solidify this knowledge and apply it right now the next time stress hits.
Excellent. These questions force you to look at the immediate dynamics of your internal family during a crisis. First, what parts of yourself are most prominent during times of stress? Naming the primary responders is essential. Is it the rigid, critical manager yelling instructions, or is it the impulsive firefighter grabbing for a distraction?
Second, how do your managers respond specifically when your exiles are activated? Do they ramp up self-criticism to an extreme level? Do they force you into frantic, overworking, or isolating behaviors? Recognizing this rigid feedback loop is key to inserting the self into that equation.
And third, in what specific ways can you, operating from the self, nurture your exiles to help them feel safe and truly heard? The ultimate goal is to heal the core wound. What is that vulnerable part, the scared child, the shamed teenager? What does it need from the calm, courageous self right now? Safety, validation, a simple acknowledgement that their pain was real.
By becoming more attuned to these voices within, you can navigate the controlling managers and the distracting firefighters more effectively. This identification process is the entire path to cultivating a compassionate relationship with those exiles, ensuring they no longer have to hide in the dark, desperate for protection.
It's the beginning of coming home to yourself.
That's beautifully put.
As we conclude this deep dive into identifying your inner parts, let's quickly recap the internal architecture we've explored. We've established the 3 primary categories of parts: the exiles holding the frozen trauma and pain, the managers proactively trying to control life to prevent that pain from surfacing, and the firefighters reactively distracting or numbing us when the exiles break through.
And most importantly, we centered this whole system around the intrinsic leader, the self, embodying calmness, curiosity, compassion, and courage. Recognizing these distinct parts, their intent, their history, and their current function, is not just a theory. It is the foundational, practical first step towards self-leadership, toward healing the inner child and moving fundamentally beyond the constraints of past trauma.
This knowledge is the start of truly empathetic internal governance.
And remember, the journey of internal exploration is deeply personal. It's often nonlinear, and it requires immense patience. There is no right or wrong way to experience this process. So embrace the learning opportunities that arise. Every insight, every frustrating moment when a firefighter takes over, every moment of clarity, it's all vital information. Give yourself permission to explore your inner world at your own pace, meeting every part with the kindness it deserves.
And finally, let's leave you with a provocative thought to mull over. One that bridges the gap between identification and deep healing. Since we know that every part, even the destructive firefighter engaging in excessive behavior like binge eating or substance use, since we know it's fundamentally trying to help you survive and avoid catastrophic emotional pain.
We have to look past the behavior.
We have to look past the behavior to the deeper intent. So if your most challenging internal part is trying desperately to outrun a feeling or a fear, what is the deepest, most terrifying fear that part is actually trying to outrun? Explore the why of the defense, and the compulsive behavior starts to lose its power over you.
A powerful thought to end on. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.